Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Peters, and I am here in my library, and I am holding up a copy of Jess Montgomery's third kinship mystery called The Stills. So, Jess, it's really a treat to see you. Thank you for signing our books.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you for asking me to do that.
Well, I've been delighted. In fact, this is the third book in this series that Jess has signed for us, and I'm really fascinated with it. It takes place in southeastern Ohio. Is
Mhm.
Kinship County a real place?
It is not. Kinship is the county seat, is a made up county seat of a made up county, Bronwyn County. Um, and I kind of created Bronwyn County from the corners of four existing counties in southeastern Ohio for a couple of reasons. One was I wanted to bring in natural elements of those areas, caves, coal mining, agriculture. And also, I didn't want people to think I was telling the history of a true county. So,
Sure, I can understand that. So the Ohio River, does it border the eastern edge of this county?
no, it's a few miles, well, not a few miles, it's probably about 30 miles south of where this takes place.
Okay. So looking at a map of Ohio, if Cleveland and Toledo are up on the lake and Columbus is kind of in the center,
Yes,
and Cincinnati is on the river.
yes.
So, yep,
Mhm.
over towards the west. So, where we're talking about is over on the east side. And I'm gathering that it was an area where, as you describe it in the book, quite a lot of mining went on.
Yes, it's southeastern Ohio, so it abuts West Virginia, is to the east. Kentucky is to the south, and it's in the Appalachian foothills, that part of Ohio. And at the time that this novel is set, there were 80 little coal mining towns dotted throughout that region of Ohio. And some of them were like the coal mining company in town that I include in my books. Some of them were quite liberal. Some of them were privately owned. There was one that was a socialist company where everybody owned an equal share. So most of them were what we think of as the traditional kind of company town. But yeah, lots of coal mining back in the day. Still some, but not as much.
So, was the coal used locally for smelting?
Well, coal was shipped out across the state and across the country from that area. So it was
I thought
used.
that I recalled in this book that there's stills up in these hills because
Oh yeah.
we're talking Appalachia, and we're in 1927, which is Prohibition. But don't I recall that there was smelting activity going on?
Yes, there's a reference to earlier. You're thinking, I think, of the smelting that was taking place in the past, and there's an old iron furnace that's sort of a derelict furnace now. It's a ruin, but that part of the industry played itself out by like the early 1900s. Coal mining kept going. Even like I said, there's still a few coal mines in the area.
I don't know that people think of Ohio as being part of Appalachia, but certainly this part of Ohio definitely is. So,
They don't, yeah,
okay. And of course, it's right across the river from Kentucky.
yes.
But inevitably, when the Scots came and the Welsh came to, that part of the United States, they did bring their whiskey making traditions with them. But now that we're in Prohibition, and we're what, 7 years in? When was the Vogel Act passed? 1920?
Yeah, it was passed in 1920, January of, lasted till December of 1933, so almost 14 years. But of course, it wasn't a binary switch that went off. It wasn't like the whole country was wet and then the whole country was dry, and then the whole country went back to being wet again. There were lots of places that it was basically local municipalities could decide. If they were going to be dry or not. And where Lily, the sheriff who's the star of this series, lives and works, her area would have been dry for quite a while. So she would have grown up with A, local prohibition, small p, and B, tons of stills in the foothills here and there and dotted all around. And so her attitude, very pragmatically, was that, this is just a tradition that's gone on for a long time. And if it means, Uncle Joe is making a little bit of moonshine for Aunt Stella, then, fine. But in this book, since it's, like you say, set in 1927, which is a fascinating year in Prohibition, bootlegging and our uber villain, George Vogel, who's a big time bootlegger and mob boss, essentially brings all that crime to Bronwyn County. And so Lily can't just say, well, it's a local thing and whatever. She has to face it. So,
well, she does in part because the federal government's going to send in prohibition agents. Prohibition, while it might have started from a good impulse. I mean, I grew up in Winnetka, just north of Evanston, where the Women's Christian Temperance Union had a really big presence, and so it was a big force behind getting the prohibition, the Vogel Act, passed.
Absolutely.
Unfortunately, by trying to legislate alcohol and drinking habits and so forth, like many attempts to legislate morality, it had a spectacularly bad underside and led really to organized crime to a larger degree in the United States, brought in, the mafia to make profits, and certainly for people who had a long history of, well, there still isn't making alcohol. It was a good source of revenue for them. The real tragedy is that maybe those guys were still making pure whiskey, or pure corn liquor, so to speak. But an awful lot of people ended up really injured or dying from the industrial alcohol and other things that were introduced into prohibition alcohol. And I often wonder, did people stop and wonder, was drinking really going to be worth it? I mean, blind drunk was not a joke. It was an actual possibility.
It was absolutely. And your point about, did people stop and think, is it worth it? That was actually the government's intent in 1926 in putting methanol in industrial alcohol, was that, well, people would get sick and they would think, oh, it's just not worth it. But of course, people would have to be aware that what they had been using to make their bathtub gin, so to speak, is now suddenly lethal, or very, very poisonous. And they weren't necessarily. And by the end, I've read some articles that estimate about 10,000 people died from alcohol poisoning because methanol was put in industrial alcohol. It's still in there, by the way, for anybody out there who's thinking of making their own bathtub gin. Please don't.
Yeah, I mean, it's, we're going through a sort of a similar thing over marijuana, where you've got all these patchwork. I mean, Arizona recently passed it as legal, but the federal government doesn't recognize that. And their local communities or whatever can protest it. But one of the really dangerous aspects of marijuana, legal marijuana as well as illegal marijuana, it has to be a cash business, since it's not federally recognized, which leads to all kinds of potential crime. If you've got a lot of cash and you can't bank it easily and you can't take credit cards and all the rest of it, then you're ripe for for a heist, for all kinds of bad things to happen. So it's really, really fascinating to me how we try to keep people from doing bad things.
Yeah, but people from doing what people are going to do anyway. And there were some good impulses. You mentioned the Temperance League. There was the Anti-Saloon League that was headquartered in Westerville, Ohio, just outside of Columbus, our capital city. It's the little dot in the middle of Ohio that pins us down on a map. But the impulse was, well, people drink too much, they become alcoholic. That's a problem. So we'll just force this to stop. And I think a more compassionate view would be, Well, yes, a small percentage of people who imbibe alcohol did become ill with that particular disease. How can we help them? And I think we should probably take the same attitude about, as you were mentioning, marijuana or opioids. Can we help people rather than trying to force them to not be the human beings that they are?
Yeah. We were watching an episode of Vera, the long running series that takes from Anne Cleeve's novels about Vera Stanhope set up in around Newcastle in England. And one of the big opening scenes and went on in a recent episode was a needle sharing and methadone clinic so that people who were addicts could come in and have access to clean needles and
Mhm.
um, methadone and all. And then the New York Times ran a piece on Sunday about the resurgence of HIV in Pakistan,
Oh,
pediatric HIV. And they
oh,
figured out that most of it was coming from the fact that they reused needles. They didn't dispose of needles properly and so forth, but they were reusing them. So all these kids that would go in for, look like a safe shot against something wound up getting infected with HIV. So it brought home to me, that needle, I mean, without any kind of decent sanitary practices, again, the consequences were going to be horrendous. So I bring all that up because in the stills, you've got a guy named George Vogel who's thinking up a clever workaround
uh-huh.
for the Volstead Act because his patent medicine, Vogel tonic, which had alcohol, I gather, was okay under the Vogel Act.
Yeah. There were so many loopholes in the Vogel Act, in the Volstead Act.
Also,
Uh, you know,
yeah, I'm the one who made it up.
those are very similar names, come to think of it. That it was easy, if you were clever, you could find all kinds of workarounds. And for example, if you were a farmer and you kept a barrel of cider outside your door, that was fine, a hard cider. But if you had beer, that was not fine. How does
Right.
this make sense?
So
Um,
Mr. Vogel wants to expand his empire for Vogel tonic by, well, you can tell us how the story sets up. But I thought it was really interesting that the tonic allowed him to, in fact, patent medicine, most of it back then, and even earlier into the 19th century, it was mostly alcohol.
Yeah. And as long as you had a prescription from your doctor, you could go buy this tonic that was, very watered down alcohol, but it was alcohol. So yes, he sets up he wants to set up a plan whereby the alcohol that he's purchasing to use to create the legal tonic gets basically hijacked, and then he gets the insurance money, and then but he set up the hijacking so that he can then turn around and sell bootleg it essentially. So clever guy, based on a real person.
Well, but I mean, he was, I think, an example of how people did manage to find opportunities for crime
Yep.
in Prohibition. But let's go back because we haven't really had a conversation about this series. Let's go back and talk about your main focus character, Lily, and how she, because she's based on a real person, right?
She is, yes. Lily Ross is inspired by the true first female sheriff in Vinton County, Ohio in 1925, a woman named Maud Collins. Um, we've had 3 female sheriffs since then. One in 76 was the second one, so a long time passed. Then in the year 2000, and then this past election cycle, we got our 4th female sheriff. Now, there have been plenty of female police officers, deputy sheriffs, and so forth, but only 4 county sheriffs in the state of Ohio in all of our history. And Maud Collins was the first. And when I ran across her, I was really fascinated by the notion of a female sheriff in 1925 anywhere, but particularly in the Appalachian foothills of Ohio. And I have to say, I would never have been like trying to come up with a character and thought, I'll just make up a female sheriff in 1925 Appalachian, Ohio. That's realistic. But once I ran across her, I was really intrigued. And of course, my writer's mind started thinking, well, what if in real life, Maud tragically lost her husband in the line of duty. He was just trying to serve a summons for a traffic violation and was shot dead by the person he was serving the summons to. There were tons of witnesses, so no mystery. Tragedy, but no mystery. But I thought, well, what if we didn't know who killed this poor man and why? And what if his wife, who works as the jail matron, is asked to step in to fulfill his term, which is what happened with Maud, and she uses this as an opportunity to investigate what happened to her husband. So it's a pretty simple premise, but from there, as I started researching and learning more about the area, and I was drawn to it too because my family's from Appalachia, but in Kentucky. So, a different part of Appalachia, and Appalachia is not a monolith by any means, but I related to that culture and that area. So I started realizing there's just so much to pull in between workers' rights, women's rights, coal mining, unionization, the era itself. And then I started getting fascinated about how would these big sweeping parts of American history from the 1920s play out, but in a rural area, not in Atlantic City or New York or San Francisco. So that's really where the impetus came from.
Fascinating stuff. And, there's a modern parallel in the series that J.A. Jance writes about Joanna Brady here in Arizona in Bisbee in Cochise County, because Joanna, too, was married to a man who was the sheriff who was shot and killed. I think he was shot. Anyway, he was killed in the line of duty. And then she took over, or was asked to take over as sheriff, and then has subsequently gotten herself elected. But you have to wonder whether Lily, so to speak, i.e. Maud, would have ever become sheriff if she hadn't been married to a sheriff. I mean, it's not a career path that was really open to women in 1925. Right. Amy Stewart writes, or I think it's Amy Stewart writes also about an early female sheriff.
Deputy sheriff.
Deputy sheriff, thank you. It's not, where is it, Pennsylvania or somewhere?
I think it might be Pennsylvania. It's more on the east coast of the country, and it's set, I think, about 10 years before mine is set. And like you say, all the Cop sisters are also based on real life people. So
they are. So I mean, I find it fascinating that we're able to find women who took on these unconventional roles and did well with them, and now are inspiring crime fiction. Because obviously, as you point out, there's a lot you could write about that was going on in rural Ohio. So I'm trying to remember which order. Was The Widows the first one and The Hollows the second?
Yes, absolutely. The Widows was the first one, and that sets up, we meet Lily, we meet Marvina. So all the books are dual narrated. As you mentioned earlier, Kinship is the county seat of Bronwyn County, but kinship is also an idea. So I really wanted to have a series where, yes, the sheriff works hard, she's an individual, she's tough, but she also understands that she needs the community to help her as much as she needs to help the community. So each book is dual narrated with Lily and another character. And in the first one, it's Marvina, a woman who was friends with Lily's husband when they were younger. And so they worked together to figure out who killed the sheriff in the first book. In The Hollows, like you mentioned, Lily would not have just ran and been elected sheriff in her own right. If her husband had been the grocer and she'd said, I think I'm going to be sheriff, that would not have happened. So she does feel guilt that now she has this career that she loves that she would never have had if she hadn't lost the husband that she loves. And how Maud Collins felt in real life, I don't know. But she did go on to, in real life, to run in 1926 and won in a landslide to continue to be sheriff, and then had a full career in various aspects of law enforcement. So anyway, I thought in The Hollows, it would be interesting to kind of explore that survivor's guilt, if you will, along with, solving a crime. And then by the time we get to the stills, She's at peace with that. Yes, she loves her job, and now she's trying to figure out, how to balance this with moving on emotionally. Pardon me. And she has a couple kids, and how to deal with that and so forth.
Well, she's not very old. I mean, the concept of
She's
widow,
not.
I mean, unfortunately, people died as they always have, young. So she's a young widow. And at some point, really to balance the series and the characters, you're probably going to have to introduce somebody into her life that
I
might be
probably am.
a partner. But anyway, she's got relatives. Where actually the book begins right around Thanksgiving and proceeds apace through the holidays. But Marvina gets towards the end of the book, at the end of the book, there's possibility of a new role for Marvina also.
Yes.
But anyway, there's the family. There's Aunt Nell, and she has become a widow. Uncle Henry has died, and people think maybe it was a stroke out in the field, but then we begin to think that maybe it wasn't.
That's right.
In the field, but something deliberate. But anyway, they own a farm, which appears to be valuable, and that's what attracts the attention of the evil George Vogel, who
Yeah.
has remarried a woman named Fiona, who has a considerable agenda of her own in this book.
She does. Fiona was a member of the kinship community in the first two books, but she was a very minor character. She, in the first book, was the wife of a deputy sheriff, and then she moves on. And in the second book, she's seeing George Vogel, but that's all we really know about her, is that she's she's caught his eye somehow. And the first two books, Lily shares the narration with women who are different than her, but also embrace the local community very much. So I thought, well, wouldn't it be fascinating for her to share the telling of the story with a woman who has rejected the community, who wants out, who wants bigger things, to heck with being in rural Ohio. She wants to be in the big city of Cincinnati with this powerful gangster husband. But she's in a little over her head, and like you say, she has her own agenda. So it was interesting to juxtapose those two. On the surface, Lily and Fiona are very different women. Lily's all about the rule of law and doing things the right way, and the kinship community, and Fiona's all about, not so concerned about the rule of law. Obviously, she's married a gangster and wants the heck out of kinship. But at the same time, they're both driven by a desire to have some control over their lives and to protect the people they love most. And in both cases, it's their children.
Yes, I thought Fiona was a really interesting and complicated character. Let's not do any spoilers here, but
Okay.
so that's too bad, because it would be fun to talk about her. But I did like her voice, and I did like the interesting way she thought about whether she could reshape George's plans in a way that would further her own. I mean, it does appear that divorce is a possibility in this story, whereas I think divorce in the 1920s was still really hard. So I thought that Fiona was pretty forward-looking in that sense. But good for her. The other thing I thought you did a really good job with is to remind us, we're talked about people getting killed in the line of duty or because they own a farm that perhaps somebody would like to take. But just the role of illness itself. I mean, medicine, we were barely into aspirin at this point. We don't have any way to combat tuberculosis, which was always a horrible scourge in Appalachia, or cancer, or people died of appendicitis, all kinds of things. So you've obviously done quite a lot of work here to talk about medical conditions at the time, not just alcohol poisoning, but things that happened to you that you couldn't control.
Yeah. It was interesting to do some digging and bring that in as just an aspect of how fragile life was on so many levels, not only politically or, living in such a remote area, but also I also brought in the weather because I wanted to explore. It was actually my editor's suggestion. She said, why don't you write a book set in the winter? And I said, you know how hard it is to get around in Appalachia on a nice day in the summer? And she's like, I know, but what if you really challenge yourself and set a book in the winter? So I did. And it ended up being a great decision and a great suggestion because it like the medical conditions explored in the novel, shows just how fragile life is, which I think emphasizes why community and wanting to help one another is so important for our survival and for our happiness. So yeah, I'm not sure how much to say because I don't want to give away too many spoilers, like you said.
We don't want to, but it's a hard scrabble life. It's hard to keep warm. It's hard to have enough food. You can understand why people actually did want alcohol. I mean, for a variety of reasons. And it's too bad they didn't use it more often, for sterilizing things. And so,
Yeah, that's right.
we're still, gosh, what are we, 1927, probably at least a decade from penicillin. I think penicillin was the late 1930s, but wasn't manufactured in any, that's part of the problem. We've just seen it with the whole vaccine issue. It's this one thing to find a drug like penicillin or a COVID vaccine. It's a whole nother thing to get it into production in any quantity that can be useful. And then it's yet another thing to actually distribute it so that people who need it can have access to it. So I think alcohol played a big role in health in the sense it was the only real anesthetic you had if you were going to have a medical procedure, unless they just knocked you out. Because there wasn't, I mean, we did have, by then we had ether and so forth, but it probably wasn't all that prevalent in southwestern Ohio. I mean, Queen Victoria had ether for her last, childbirth, but it was not a drug for the ordinary person.
Right.
It was a way to, it was a way to stay warm, a way to combat shock. If you thought of it, it was a way to sterilize wounds and sterilize other stuff. So, I mean, alcohol, aside from drinking it, had any number of valuable applications. And I thought that I wonder if they really thought about that when they passed the Volstead Act.
I don't know. It's an interesting, prohibition is fascinating. It really is. Until I started writing books set in this era, I think I thought of it as many people do, as just, well, that was kind of a silly experiment. And I didn't understand how long it lasted and how many angles there were to why it became the law. And it was actually considered, the first wedge issue in our country because prohibition was a proxy for so many other social issues. And actually right outside, which I think is very cool that they acknowledge this, the Anti-Saloon League now has a museum. It's not a functioning league anymore, but there's the Anti-Saloon League Museum up in Westerville. And there's a huge sculpture outside that is of a wedge splitting a rock. And it's because, to symbolize the original wedge issue used to divide people over all kinds of other issues.
Well, I mean, I would have thought slavery was the first wedge issue, but major wedge issue. But certainly I agree with you that prohibition definitely has been one in, controlling tobacco, controlling marijuana, drugs in general. There are lots. Unfortunately, we seem to have a plethora of world wedge issues at the moment, which is making, I still can't figure out how, something like wearing a mask has become a political statement. It's just amazing to me. But anyway, you definitely make a good point in the book that it is a wedge issue and there are arguments on both sides. The other thing about prohibition that really was so dangerous is that it created a whole scofflaw mentality. It was illegal, but ordinary people broke the law, knew they were breaking the law, and it was like an everyday thing to do that, which I think has, an overall really bad effect on law enforcement and, respect for government and whatever. I mean, it's the same way. There's virtually no way to police the mask mandates.
Right.
I
And
mean, and
yeah,
so it does create kind of the same kind of scofflaw environment when, people feel perfectly free to ignore those mandates, and yet there's no penalty for it, or nobody's, actually even trying to enforce them. And it's hard. I mean, a business like mine, it's really hard to be a small business and be forced to take on the enforcement role.
absolutely.
You
Yeah,
know,
I can only
um,
imagine.
yeah, no, it really is. I mean, I have an older staff, and we made a decision to protect them.
Yes.
And even though our governor has ripped away, everything in terms of numbers and mass and so forth, we are not going to follow that. And I think we're going to see a surge because there's bound to be one as soon as everybody stops paying attention. But you know, what can I say? But it reminds me, or it made me think when reading your book, how that the same attitudes and um, difficulties would have been so prevalent in Prohibition, from community to community, maybe from household to household, where some members, felt strongly pro-prohibition and many felt, very much against it. I
Right.
mean,
And as time went on, people became weary of trying to enforce it and realizing it was impossible to enforce. And, the 27 was the year that the Bureau of Prohibition became its own bureau. It wasn't a unit of another bureau. It was its own bureau, which is one reason of several, that I wanted the book set in 1927 to bring prohibition to the forefront of the plot. But they were spread so thin and paid so poorly, and it's such a huge country. How do you get into every nook and cranny? And like I said earlier, there's so many loopholes. You mentioned it. I don't think this is a spoiler, but you mentioned it starts at the beginning of Thanksgiving, and Lily's mama is so excited because she has, and these are real um, wine bricks. They were basically compressed grapes, and if you just add water and forget to put in bicarbonate of soda, and happen to forget that you've left it in a dark place for 3 weeks, well, it'll ferment and you'll have wine. And it's perfectly legal. And so she was very excited to have this wine for Thanksgiving. I visited the Anti-Saloon League when I was researching this book in the before times, and I imagine I'm one of the few people who yelped in great glee upon seeing on display one of these wine grape bricks, these vino grape bricks in their display case. I'm like, yes, I just read about this. This is in my book.
it probably was pretty vinegary and nasty, but
Yeah, I,
haven't pursued this, but I've often wondered, did the church have an exemption so that they could offer, wine at communions, those
I
churches
think
that,
they did. I know I remember reading about this, and I think the Catholic Church did have an exemption for
well,
this.
it's not just the Catholic Church. I mean, many Christian churches offer wine at communion. I grew up in
That's
the
true.
Episcopal Church, and, there it was. And, wine is part of Jewish services,
That's true.
So, I mean, the whole thing was just, to be honest, a really dumb idea. But it's one of those things where it tipped over into enough votes to actually pass it. But the difficulty with anything like that is if the population in general does not support a law like that, then it does become nearly impossible to enforce it. And that leaves us in poor directions. I mean, one of the people who profited the most from this was Joseph Kennedy. I mean, I've been on the two little islands off Canada that were the rum running bases.
You've been on,
Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, they're called. And
okay.
they're actually part of France. They are the furthest west parts of the province of Brittany, and there are these two little islands floating there off eastern Canada. And I love this story, which you will appreciate. When we were visiting, they're pretty scrubby. There's not, they're not forested. and so forth. And yet, as you wander around Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, you observe this enormous amount of housing and other buildings that are all made out of wood. And you think, how did that happen? And how it happened was that when the wine or the liquor was brought over from Canada, it was in wooden crates. And so they broke up
Oh,
the crates in order to transport the alcohol. And Kennedy was the big rum runner in this operation. And so the locals took advantage of all the broken wooden crates to do their building.
that's
And
very clever.
yeah, no, it really was. But I mean, I grew up in Chicago, so we all had stories about, the Merchandise Mart and the 1960 election. Because I was at Stanford by then, but my parents were still in Chicago, and they were deeply Republican, so they regarded the whole thing as, stolen. But anyway, it was interesting. It was only when I was on Saint-Pierre and Miquelon that I realized that much of the stories I'd heard about the Kennedy fortune turned out to be true.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, it was. So, there was a lot of money to be made during
Yeah, yeah. And there was a lot of money to be made, and the law created those opportunities and also created criminals out of people who weren't criminals.
That's right.
I mean, of course, the people chose that they were going to, the people who became criminals made that choice. So it's not like it directly, created a George Vogel, but there were always going to be people who would make that choice and take those opportunities. So it was a naive law in many ways.
It was.
And it was,
Totally. No, I
yeah.
agree with you entirely. So we have Lily. This is her third investigation. I really love the Widows and the Hollows and now the Stills. And Jess has been kind enough to autograph all of them for us. And I think they are wonderful, wonderful books in terms of plot, but also just to get yourself familiar with a part of the country that you might not know all that well at a time, which was full of intrigue and change and upheaval. And we all know, unfortunately, what lies ahead. So I guess my final question for you is, what lies ahead for Lily? Are you deeply at work in book 4? Or you already moved on to book 5? Or where are we?
I have completed book 4 in the sense that I turned in a draft, a decent draft, a B+ draft, I think, to to my editor, and I'm awaiting her feedback, and then I'll have some revision, of course, based on her notes and some ideas I've had since turning it in. So yes, that book is supposed to be out in 2022. I'm guessing about the same time next year as the Stills came out this year, and it's called The Echoes, and we move forward in time to 1928. And it kind of deals with PTSD and which would not have been a term at the time, but that's what it deals with, and delves even more deeply into family. We've learned a lot about Daniel's family throughout the series, Daniel being Lily's first husband, but I thought it was time to learn a little bit more about Lily's family. So
Very
I'm
good idea. Well, you do a wonderful job, Al. I can tell that you love research and you do point out the travels, at least local travels, that you have made to check into making everything as authentic as you can. But the real engine for these stories is really family and family relationships. Solving the crime is part of what allows you to investigate the family dynamics. And as in many successful series, you've got an ensemble cast going, so people care a lot about what happens, not just to Lily, but to Marvina. Then you're introducing a new character called Benjamin, and then, there
yes.
are kids involved. And, Fiona, whom we mentioned earlier, has a son called Leon. And, the opportunities for all these characters to grow and develop as you write the books is unlimited.
Yep, and that makes it really enjoyable and exciting.
It is fun. Well, for those of you who have not run across Jess and her books, I certainly recommend them. I will try holding up. It's going to look funny, but there it is. Anyway, The Stills by Jess Montgomery. There we go.
Oh, that's great.
You have autographed copies left at the Poison Pen, and you can certainly order paperbacks of The Widows and the Hollows because you could read this book all by itself. You don't need to read the earlier books, but I think you'd enjoy them. Sometimes people find a new book and then go back. And then
Right.
some people want to just start at the beginning and read forward. So it's fortunate with only 3 books in, it's not going to be a colossal task.
Right.
Carry the whole
You
series.
can join me now and go along for the ride.
That's right. No, it's good. It's good to catch you before, we're like book 13 and everybody is daunted. And then they say,
Right.
where were you when she was writing the first 12 books, dummy? And I don't want to do that. So anyway, it's been great to talk to you, Jess. Thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. This will become a podcast. I will send you the link to it, and we'll run it on the homepage of the Poison Pen website for a while, but it'll stay a permanent video, probably on YouTube and other stuff. So I'll send you all those links. Okay.
That sounds awesome.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.
Wonderful. Bye. Thank you. And thank you
Bye-bye.
for watching us, those of you who are.